So they bring this girl, this woman to him, and had been caught in adultery, and so they ask him, what are you going to do? And he says to them, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So they all disappear. And then he says to her, where are thy accusers? And well, no one. Okay, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Now, this passage has often been looked upon by many people today as saying, say you shouldn't judge. We shouldn't judge. That's not what he's saying, because he did make a judgment. Go and sin no more. That is a judgment. But he didn't allow them to follow through with the stoning. And in context of the new covenant, in context with Paul's contrast between the tablets of stone and tablets of the flesh, or the new covenant where the law is written in your heart, it makes perfect sense. That the law is not something that needs to be externally enforced, but is internally adopted. And this is something that many Christians had come to see as a reality to be adopted here and now. And so the idea that you would need state enforcement of divine authority, or any type of authority for that matter, was seen as absurd. And so this is a situation where all of a sudden you're getting to a point where, on what basis do you exercise authority is being questioned with renewed vigor. And it is in this context, I believe, that St. Paul issues, because St. Paul himself many times had contrasted faith versus the law. And the law, something that you obey because it says so, and you're doing so out of duty or obligation, doesn't have the power to turn and convert the heart. But the internal dynamics, the reality of love, and the internal embracing of God's principles and God's ideal out of love for God himself, because we're in a new covenant where God's law is written in our heart, that has the power to turn the heart. And if you turn the heart, you automatically follow the law. You don't follow the law because it says so. You follow the law because it's a part of, embracing the God within one's heart. And this was considered to be what Jesus has come to establish. So this is not just a religious question. It has questions of external political authority, too. It has implications. And these implications are popping up. And so in the letter to the Romans, Paul is addressing the issue of the role of the state. And he gives his famous take that the role of the state is to wield the sword and act as a protector of the innocent against evildoers. Now, the term wield the sword is kind of interesting because in the New Covenant it talks about beating your swords into plowshares and studying war no more. So he's using a term that has temporary relevance to the audience. So some of the people are saying, okay, yeah, that's true, but that's, okay, we can live with that for a while. But it's not seen as absolute, because he's used, the term wield the sword refers back to, it's referring to the right of the state to use force. And one of the essences of using the force is the waging war. Well, in the New Covenant, you're going to beat your swords into plowshares. And you're going to engage, instead of engage in war, you're going to engage in economic activity, plowshare, plowing. So it does, to a certain extent, answer the question. But it's coming off as a temporary expediency, not as an absolute principle in some people's eyes. Especially because the conditions under which this was said was the Christians' main source of threat to their security at that time was their fellow Jews. Later on, they became a thorn in the side of the Roman emperor, and Caesar and the Romans started cracking down on them. But for a while, they were being cast out of the synagogues and stoned for heresy by their fellow Jews who saw them as heretics. Stephen, for example. And so Paul was a Roman citizen. He actually many times appealed to the Roman notion of justice as a way to escape a lot of these tight situations he was in. And this is an example, and I mentioned earlier about this notion of justice in the Greek philosophy, and this notion, and also in the Gospels. I mean, in the writings of Paul, he refers to the Roman notion of justice. If you understand Roman notion of justice, and you read situations where he's talking about being a Roman citizen, you look at the case being involved. He's bringing up the Roman notion of justice, and it's pretty obvious that he knows the Roman notion of justice very well. And if you read a lot of his writings, he's obviously very familiar with Greek philosophy. So in Paul, you have a synthesis of the biblical notions of God-established justice, but also he's not deriving his views from the Greco-Roman tradition, but he's using the Greco-Roman tradition to reach out to the broader world, because these ideas were spread to the broader world. So where the Greco-Roman tradition was compatible with the views of justice as expressed in the Bible, he used it. He rejected it where it wasn't. And this was something that the leaders of the church, or the fathers of the church, and the scholars of the church in the Middle Ages did as well. They fused these views where they were compatible. And I mentioned this notion of justice versus the assertion of will, and how this is a biblical view. But you can find this in the Greek philosophical tradition, particularly in the writings of Plato. And Plato, he's written, the dialogues of Plato are like a bunch of plays where Socrates is the main character. And it's the philosophy of Plato is, in academic thought, is the most influential throughout Western history. As a matter of fact, there's a philosopher named Alfred North Whitehead who made his comment one time that the safest generalization of the history of Western philosophy is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Not because he had all the answers, because he raised all the questions that they were going to debate about. And Plato was a disciple of Socrates. And Socrates' whole life and his whole philosophy was based upon establishing the idea that justice has an absolute standard by which it is judged. And this argument, they went into all kinds of philosophical things that some you can agree with, some we don't agree with, some compatible with the Bible, some are not. But the essence of Socratic philosophy is that there is an absolute standard of justice. And this argument came about in the most famous of these books is called The Republic. Now, there's a lot of things in The Republic that I find lacking, to say the least. But the basis of the argument by which it got started, how they're going to solve the problem, is a problem. But their analysis of the problem is compatible with the Judeo-Christian notion. And this is the question of what is justice.